Welcome to Specialising in Success, bringing your skill set to game development. My name is Jason Imms, Head of QA for Keywords Australia, and I'm very excited to be your chair for this session alongside some old friends of mine. Coincidentally, we've all worked together in various contexts. But it is my pleasure to introduce, you're all out of order because you're sitting in different places. Narrative Design Lead at Mighty Kingdom, Francis Warner. We've got Sarah Elliot, Rigging and Art Specialist at Dino Rocket. We've got Nathan Pana, Senior UI Artist at Playside Studios. And finally, Senior Producer at Mighty Games Group. And my colleague at Keywords, Lucie Migne. Please give them a round of warm welcome. So this panel represents an incredibly broad range of weird jobs, as you can kind of tell from the titles on the screen behind us. A broad range of career experiences and kind of much more that even these titles would imply. I, for one, work in quality assurance now and have done for many years, but had a weird break in the middle of my career, and I was a full-time games journalist, which was a lot of fun, but you know, I have bills to pay, so I've ended up back in QA again. I worked for most of the major mastheads around the world. It was a huge departure from my career, from my education, but it was how I found my way into the games industry in the first place. And you know, it's a weird story if you follow it along. I'm also a hiring manager, and I found a lot of success in hiring people from outside the games industry who have technical skills, and then just teaching them the game stuff. It can become relatively easy. And the rest of the panelists here today have similarly circuitous paths into the sector and their present day roles, and represent some of the least understood disciplines in games. So I'm excited for us to go into some of that today, to talk about how they found their way into games and what it's like to represent these kind of disciplines that are largely misunderstood, and what it means to be the person to represent them. So we're going to kick off today. This is your conversation. I'm here to chair it, but it's boring if I'm interviewing you and you just kind of answer the questions down the line. So please consider it a conversation. I would love a bit of back and forth, a bit of disagreement, maybe even some juicy arguments about whose discipline is the least well represented. We'll see how we go. But we'll start with a bit of a rundown about your fascinating backgrounds. Lucie, the heck is a hydrographic surveyor?
Yeah, that's me. That's what a hydrographic surveyor can look like. I'm originally French, and I studied hydrographic surveying in France, came to Australia for that particular job, and then through a series of events, at the end of that career, I found myself into games, mostly through networking, to be honest, at the time, and because I was able to sell like transferable skills to my first employer in games. Mighty Build and Test is my second employer in games, and then they've made me grow again into a different career. So a hydrographic surveyor is someone who does maps for boats. Yeah.
It's cooler than that. You told me stories about hanging out of airplanes.
Well, the particular branch of it that we did in Adelaide was with LiDAR. So LiDAR is pretty much a laser in a plane. So I did get to jet set around the world in a plane. It is a pretty cool story. And there are a whole lot of transferable knowledge from that career into games. How does sound work? How does light work? How does it refract on water? How does it travel? You know, how long does it take to go from point A to point B? That sort of stuff. How is gravity working? You probably don't have to think about it when you play the game, but when people make the game, even if it's just a basic racing game, you do need your cars to stay on the road, and they stay down the road because people have implemented gravity systems in the game, pretty much. So having that knowledge about how it works in real life is really, really helpful when you look at the game with a critical eye, an intentional eye to see what is working, what is not working, what throws that perception that it is real for that period of time that you're that you're immersed in that experience of the game. That's pretty much how it happened.
Brilliant. And Nate, you had a whole bunch of UX experience before you came to games. How did you find that transition? I would assume, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that UX and UI, the understanding of that discipline in games is vastly less mature than it is outside an enterprise software land.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing is with UX in general, I think even outside of games, that's often a very misunderstood area. How many people here know much about user experience or UX? I would say less than a quarter. So
seems a bit accurate.
Yeah, there's I think there's misunderstanding in the actual other industries like product design and that sort of thing as well that use UX, but UI as well. I often find people talk about, what do you do? And I say, I do UI as well. And a lot of people are looking to get into games through, I guess, the traditional sense of I want to make the cool things happen. I want to make all of the action happen. I want to make the mechanics and stuff like that. But they don't consider UI as integral, I guess, to game making, even though if you consider it, UI itself is, I guess, for some games, it's the entire game almost. There's a system behind the UI, and then it's panel after panel, button after button. But it does sort of seem as though a lot of people are not particularly zeroed in on choosing that as a job. So I'm here to say it is a real job. So if you're interested in doing it, I would love to chat with anyone about UI design or UI artist work, which is basically what I'm doing at the moment. But my transition from outside of games to into games, I think, there was definitely still a little bit of misunderstanding of, you're going to do these extra things. And it's like, no, this is actually like its own discipline, and it's not artwork for UI. It is artwork in the sense that you're creating visuals, but it's not like rendered 2D artwork or 3D models or anything like that. So I think it can be misunderstood in that regard. But I came from a web background. Actually, I worked in web design, what was called web design in the mid-2000s. I don't know, do they still call it that? But yeah, it came from a web and app design background, and all those skills that I sort of had there from a visual perspective, and even things like graphic design, if you're in that sort of field, a lot of those principles really move through and they really help support UI for any sort of digital product, games included. So that was sort of, it makes sense as a transition, I think. And I feel as though a lot of people don't quite make that connection. They're often like, I do graphic design, so I must do signage or logos or whatever it is. It's like, well, guess what? Games have marketing teams. They have logos. They have UI, buttons, branding. They have identities that they have to uphold and stuff like that as well. So it's there. It just feels like it's under-tapped, I'd say.
That's fair. I have a condescending question for the audience. Can shout out a few of the most common kind of game development jobs that you can think of. Hit us. Louder, please. Programmer. Good. Animator. Ooh, good. Any more? Sound design. Annoying, but good. Thank you. You're too niche for me. I want it broad. All right, cool. The most common ones are the ones that everyone kind of attributes. We need programmers, we need designers, and we need artists. And they're really broad categories. And as studios scale in size, we start to see those categories break down into more specializations. And it can be quite difficult if you're one of the first people in one of those studios representing one of those specializations, because the job isn't just doing the work at that point, is it? It's about kind of training the studio to get better at accepting these new roles within it, right? How do you feel about that, Sarah, as a rigger in the studios that you've worked with?
So I am, as well as rigging, I do some of the common things, art and animation. I wear my little generalist hat a lot of the time. But starting off in a studio that hasn't really had any pipeline or rigging, they just kind of go, we've got some pictures, we want them to move. there is steps between art and animation that you need to do to be able to get them to move, because otherwise you're just going to have something that bounces up and down on a screen. If you want characters to turn around or to talk, that's when rigging and that's when pipeline starts to come in. And so I found that there can be a little bit of a disconnect between how do we get from A to B. And it's often seen as, so rigging, if you talk to anyone in game dev, a lot of the time they kind of think it's some sort of magical art, and they're like, I don't know how it works, it just happens.
That's correct, isn't it? That is not correct.
Yep.
Based on my experience, it's true.
Yep. Everyone kind of has that response, and at its core, all of game dev is just problem solving, and rigging and pipeline as an extension of rigging is just another form of problem solving. And so back to your question about how to get a robust and, I guess, efficient system for a character to go from concept art to actual final art to being rigged, animated and implemented in a game, how to get that into a studio and how to get that running is just taking some time to really slow down and explain to the people around you that these are the steps that need to happen. Because a lot of the time just visualizing things, that's one of the biggest issues that I've come across in my career, is having to word good, pretty much. And that's something that I think we all would have come across in our weird little niches that we sit in at one point or another, is trying to, I guess, validate that this is a really important part of the process. That if you need something to move, if you need a character to move, it's got to be animated, it's got to be rigged, it's got to be made correctly. Like if you want someone to be able to navigate a menu correctly and not want to scream at the computer because the play button is in the wrong spot that doesn't feel right, as part of a very dumbed down version of what UX is. I'm so sorry.
No, I mean, you are sort of touching on the same sort of thing, though. You know, like when one of my previous roles went in with no UX department at all, and people kind of being like, "Oh, that job that you're talking about, that's what someone else does off the side of their desk," and it's like, no, the rigging is an actual thing. It's something that people need to focus on, and people need to focus on that as a job. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to come into a company that, when I got my start in games, in full-time games, where there was already a few people doing more specialised roles. And since then, I've taken that to smaller companies and said, all right, like this is how you can set things up. This is how we can do things, and you can get the most out of limited resources, because games really are about how can we make the money go the longest way and get the most content for our players and make the best things. So yeah, it's just talking to people. There's a lot more talking to people in game dev than I ever would have anticipated. Current situation excluded. But yeah, that's the weird wibbly wobbly way to get around rigging. And
does that ring true for you too, Fran, in trying to help people understand the difference between what a writer does versus what a narrative designer does?
Sure. So I think it's good to start by saying that not every game has a narrative designer, and not every company has the inclination or the budget to afford a narrative designer, but there's no such thing as a game that doesn't have narrative content. Even if you go back, and I'm showing my age here, you go all the way back to Space Invaders, which is the simplest game I can think of, that has narrative content. The aliens are attacking your world, you're trying to defend it. There have been $200 million movies that have less narrative content in them than that game.
They made a whole last movie out of Pac-Man.
They sure did. So it's important to understand that every game has narrative design, and it's not just writing. There's no writing in Space Invaders, but it is narrative content. Some other things that we do that aren't typically thought of as narrative design, because I think there's a misconception out there that it's mostly just writing. You write character dialogue, you write item descriptions, you write intro text, you write things like flavor text. But there's environmental storytelling, so it's like, should this be dark? Should this be light? What kind of mood do we want to set? How menacing should this enemy be? And that's where we kind of get in with everyone else's discipline to kind of do that together with art and with animation and with everyone else on the content side of a project. It's just an extra thing that a narrative designer can do. So I like to say, for companies that don't have a narrative designer or don't really understand what the full skill set is, they don't really understand until they have one what one can do for them.
So on that note of that lack of understanding and trying to advocate for your discipline, how much, like what percentage of your time is doing the labour that your discipline calls for versus educating the people who work, your colleagues alongside you and the people who run the studio about how best to support that discipline to do its best work? That's an open question for everyone. Go.
I think, like,
conversation time.
I think, going into a company without that department at all, like UX or like you're saying, maybe rigging or something like that being handled, it's for like 50% of the time you're banging the drum saying, hey, this is a discipline and this is why it's here and what is needed. Again, transferring those skills from another job, I guess, explaining that to clients and things as well. So somebody's in product design doing that sort of thing and being like, oh, this is why we need to do this because our users or our players need to understand X, Y, Z. I think that as a transferable skill from, whether you work in like marketing or advertising or something like that, like interfacing with clients is kind of like, in a way, interfacing with teammates, but you can be more honest. You can kind of explain things in more direct terms in some ways. So I definitely think that's 50% of the time if you go into a new department. What do you think?
QA is a bit in a different spot, I would say, because the concept of testing the game is quite understood even outside of game production and game making. What we find ourselves quite often in the position of, though, is being in a position of being an afterthought, and that what we call pushing left, as in involve us in the discussions with the narrative designers, asking them questions about their intentions. What is their vision for the game? That is super important for us to understand, is the game actually delivering on that vision once it gets into our hands, even in an unfinished state. So that advocacy for I want to be in the room before, that is probably what is the most required still these days. It really depends on the company. And for smaller studios where there is just one QA person, which is the case in a lot of the indie developers that are being showcasing today, that discussion generally tends to happen a lot easier because it's a small team. They trust you. They've grown accustomed to it. I find the resistance comes from a little bit more when you scale up, because then people go like, but we're paying those people to do their job. Why do you have to be in the room? Do your job at the end of the chain. Thankfully, it's not happened to me, not in those terms, but I have heard enough stories from myself. I have worked with other companies where people were in that position that I would say it's unfortunately still too frequent.
And it becomes a lot about needing to justify the expense as well. Like, it's one thing to expect to pay testers at the end of the project. It's another to say you should have some number of QA analysts on the project from the very beginning right through to the end. And it's not just because we want more work to do or we want to kind of justify our own positions. It's about helping them understand this is a worthwhile expenditure.
The number of times I've had the question we can't quite afford QA right now. What do you think about just having playtesters? And then I'm going to Nathan, because we've talked a lot about user experience when we used to have desks sitting next to each other.
Yeah. I mean, but the thing I think when you were saying that stuff actually reminds me that building anything up like that is you got to build allies within the company as well, so that you can, if you're a team of one and you're coming in and saying, hey, we need QA to be involved at the very start of this process, not just like an afterthought. If you're the only person banging that drum, you need to build a team. You need some people to bang that drum with you. So, I think that's what I sort of found with UX in particular, but sometimes with UI as well, kind of being like, hey, this is a conversation that should involve these people, and making sure that other people are saying that as well. And you're not the only person who has to drag that line to every department saying, hi, we're UX, this is what we do. And, doing that all the way around. So, building allies, I think, is also another way to do it.
Otherwise, you'll see us at the end of the day going to you and be like, do you have any documentation about what you were trying to do? Because, the position of the play button, we're not sure it makes sense, but we don't know if it was on purpose or not.
Yeah.
And the question of purpose then becomes something that is really hard to solve after the fact. Really hard to solve.
Just building on that.
Yeah, go.
Getting different disciplines in early, like with QA, because if you've built a whole game, you've gotten to the end and you realize that first building block, it's really wonky. That's really hard to replace if you don't fix it early and don't see it early and catch it. And the same thing goes with rigging. A lot of the time you'll see this beautiful concept art. The characters, they'll have like these nice flowing capes, or maybe they'll have big wings or something. And if you bring a rigger in early, they can go, that's going to be really hard and expensive to rig. Maybe we could do it this way. And so in the end, you end up saving a little bit of money by including people who are aware of the future steps that are going to happen. And so game dev, like a smaller team, you wear many hats, so you're going to know more of those steps. But I've found that as companies get bigger and people have those gaps between disciplines, that communication, unless you're actively working on making sure that you're communicating with the teams around you, not just your own team, that can lead to some very big misses of where things need to be. The biggest one I can think of is when there's a fatter character that you want to rig. They are so much harder and time consuming to rig than if you want to rig a skinny character, just purely because of how the technology works. And so if I can get into a conversation early and say, well, maybe we can do this, or maybe we can fake it in this regard, it means that the pipeline is quicker. I don't have to send things back to 3D modelling or to 2D art, depending on what medium I'm working in. And then I can hand it over to animation quicker. Animation can get it animated and into the game much, much faster than if we had have just gone, brute force it to here, and then go, oh no, it's not working. And it's due next week.
I have kind of the same story. Get us in early. Because a lot of times narrative design is one of those that the game ships in 2 weeks, and it's like, can you write some stuff for this character to say? It's like, we just, like everybody else, like to be in from the ground floor. The problem is a lot of the original narrative design is often done by more generalist game designers, and they often do a great job with it, but they have very full plates as well. And if we can get in and kind of help with some of that scaffolding for the basic conceit of the game and the characters in the game and the arc, if there's a story in the game, the arc of the story, it helps out those game designers later down the line, because we don't have to say, actually, I know we're shipping in 2 months, but this doesn't quite work and we have to switch this around, and you can't call that character that. And it just, like everyone else says, it just saves a lot of time to get us in from the start. And it doesn't have to be a large investment of time. It can be just, hey, look this over, see, what do you think? And we might have a couple of notes. It doesn't have to be a big thing, but for every discipline to have some eyes on a project from the beginning, at least a little bit, I think is a great help.
But to that, I think the running theme of zooming out a little bit is just that communication thing, right? Like, if you're working in a role that requires, a lot of communication, then you may make a great producer, or you may, work. I'm just choosing jobs out of a hat here, Lucie. But
Sure.
or like an excellent QA person, something like that. They're all sort of areas where you need to have the transferable skill. Like it's not like, obviously you're going to get locked in a basement and please make me a game and then come out and do it. You need to talk to people and you need to talk to your team. So whatever job I guess you're doing outside of games, and seeing communication as a really key sort of skill. I think the teams that I've worked in that have been the most successful, I mean, it sounds stupid, but it is the ones that like talk to each other and communicate and let people know, you know, whether you're a programmer sort of coming in and handing this stuff off with someone, you're like, okay, you were in that meeting already. You understand basically what this is about. This is how I've set it up for you. Can you please make the UI as per the documentation that was written by game design? You know, like there's this sort of interconnected communication setup that I think that a lot of successful and good game studios have, and it's, you know, it's not exclusive to games. It's any job that you're doing where you are a good communicator, you will be good for games. So yeah.
And even for people in the audience who might be thinking, you know, in being inspired by what they see today and thinking, oh, you know, I can do some of it on my own. You will need help at some point. I do not know of a single game that was done by one person without even just external advice or just communication to try and publish the game. You know, get advice on how to get something onto a console. That there is an entire vetting process that most people don't know about, that some people specialize in. So, you know, you want to find those people, you want to talk about them, you want to get their knowledge, because it does save you time and money, because time is money, unfortunately, in this world. Getting to, you know, putting your product, putting your game, your pride and joy at that point in front of the eyes of others. I don't know of anything that is released that was a solitary thing. The words aren't coming out.
Endeavor.
Yes, thank you.
Is that a French word?
No, I don't think so.
But yeah, you know, like you said, there's no shame in not knowing something either. You know, like based on your seniority, or you don't want to be like, I don't know what that thing is. It's like, I'm sure Sarah has lots of things that she mentions that people are like pretending they know what it means and they just don't.
There's a heap of stuff I don't know, and I'm going to be the first one to admit it, because if I try and do something I don't know, everyone is going to be able to tell that I was lying when I said I could do it. So it's going to be better if I go, hey, Fran, can you write this like awesome narrative and just, like explain all the characters' motivations and, you know, tell us what the story is going to be, and then when, you know, I'll do the art and I'll rig it and animate it and put it in the game, and, you know, I'm really bad at making sure like the buttons look good. It's a very reductive way of describing this.
That's all my job is, don't worry.
Like knowing where your blind spots are is really good, because you can talk to, and if you've built up a wonderful relationship with the people around you. Like I've enjoyed working with all of these people in this panel. I can turn around and say, hey, I've got no idea what I'm doing in this area. Help. And they will help without making me feel bad that I don't know things.
But like, I guess another thing is, I guess, processes as well that you're learning in your current jobs. You know, like I worked for 10 years as a freelancer, which means that I worked with clients directly. I did web projects, branding projects, and those types of things. And I had conversations with clients, so I had the skill for interfacing in a professional way with people. But, you know, then I moved into things like games, and, you know, a lot of companies do sprints and do agile or scrum or like Kanban or Scrumban or whatever it is that people have chosen to call their methodology.
Just keep saying words to show that you know what you're talking about.
Yes. Yeah, it's like buzzword bingo if anyone's got a card out there.
Controversial opinion. I think they're all roughly the same.
But like, you know, coming into that thing, I didn't know, I had 10 years of experience in doing the color and the layout and design and all that sort of thing. But coming into a company where they're like, okay, well, this is how we do things. We have like a stand up in the morning. We have sprint planning. We have, you know, or we do Kanban style planning, you know, like, you know, having those conversations.
That's my day.
Yeah, that's
I organize all of those things for people.
But that's what I mean. You can have a senior person who's not from the industry come in and be like, I don't know what these are, but if you want me to make the stuff, I can do that, you know? Yeah. So there's lots of things I guess there's always lots of things to learn, but there's still, if you're in like, I guess, software development or something, you may already know those things, and you walk into a studio being like, okay, well, there's other things I need to learn. I don't need to necessarily learn the process.
Yeah. And you will do it like babies, so I need to teach you how to do it actually.
Also that.
Sorry, Lucie.
Also, the best processes are the ones that adapt to humans, not the other way around.
Now, we're at a crossroads. I want to pause here. Just for the audience in the room, apologies, those of you on the recording, what percentage of you are active kind of game makers right now? Hands up. Okay, how many of you are aspiring, looking to get into the industry? Okay, how many of you are neither and just kind of here because you were interested in the topic on the board? Okay, cool. All right. Dang, that was almost perfectly even across. I'm just going to pick one. So what I would like to do is I'm tempted to dive deeper into these kind of intra-studio politics. But given the spread, I think maybe we switch over to having conversations about taking your skill set from other sectors and bringing it over to games if that's what you want to do. There's obviously multiple pathways here. I want to start with adjacent industries where it kind of makes sense. So if you want to get into games and you think your skills can apply, but the game's the role that's being advertised is really quite explicit about using a bunch of games terminology that you kind of don't know, but you think maybe you'd be a good fit. How do you approach that role? How do you approach that application to be seen and to stand out?
Networking. One word. I come from an industry that seemingly has nothing to do with games. And it was through talking to other people that I realized that I could bring something to the role. I was actually encouraged and told about the role by someone who I knew, that my very first quality assurance role. And that was fantastic. But not everybody has, a direct friendship with someone who works in the industry. In Australia, we've got heaps of support. There are Discords, there are communities around the world. There are blogs, podcasts, all dedicated to either games in general, about the business of games, because you can be an accountant and not necessarily want to do anything but accounting, but you can still do accounting for a large game company. Eventually, they will grow big enough that they might need in-house services for that sort of stuff. So keeping an eye out on those boards, reading, there's so much material online. It's an industry that is really paradoxical. There's a lot of information that is publicly available about how to make games. And then once you're in it, especially if you work for some of the AAA studios, there's so much secrecy about what you're doing. It's so interesting.
Yeah, being asked what you work on, it's like, I just can't tell you, I'm sorry.
The standard answer is probably something you've already heard about. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a good point, though, you make about the accounting, because, games is so big now, in every regard, people who work in any department like marketing or whatever, I know that larger studios obviously have more departments and things like that, but there are ordinary jobs within game studios as well, there's accounting, there's payroll, there's HR, there's, you don't have to know anything about games to do HR in games, right? It's just a transferable job as well. So, yeah. But I mean, from my background, there are transferable skills. I think if people are looking for obviously visual jobs, it makes sense. The networking thing is just being nice to people, I think, goes a very long way. But to get an actual job in a visual area, you obviously have to provide, portfolio examples and things like that. But having been in the position of hiring people for UI roles and that sort of thing, I would say that, again, encourage people who are sort of thinking about applying and not quite meeting all of that criteria. Maybe you've made some fan art, maybe you've made some kind of personal project that's not necessarily like a game-specific thing. There are elements of your artwork or your creation that we can glean and say, this person has an eye for composition, this person has an eye for detail, whatever it is. They can mimic a style very well. So there's, I guess showing things no matter how you feel about them, maybe that other people can see more in it than you might be able to, I think.
I think the networking point is a really important one, just quickly, because we are a large industry globally. When you zoom into Australia, we're quite small. And when you zoom into a skate scale, we're quite small. And when you zoom into a city scale, we're tiny. And it really is relationships that provide opportunities in those small kinds of sectors. We can have a big conversation about nepotism. We got to be careful about that, of course. But if someone comes to you and says, this person's brilliant, I think they'd be a good fit, that is going to ring loudly in your head when you do the due diligence work of looking across their portfolio, reading resumes, checking their references. It does help. So showing up, being present at events like this, at your just local community events, joining Discords, it really is very important to the process of making that transition.
Just building on, you mentioned it's important to be a good person. When I was in hiring for a little while, doing some looking for hiring for particular roles. We always looked at applicants through the lens of you can teach a technical skill, but you can't teach someone to be a nice person. And you want to work with people who are nice, who are good because of all the communication that we talked about before. Because if someone's going to hardline say, no, this is how you do it and I'm not doing it any other way, they're going to be very hard to work with. And also building on top of that, with like maybe gaps in or like adjacent industries and gaps in resumes, like you were saying, games is one of the best industries in that you don't really need a formal education to become a game dev. Like if you have a doctor, you kind of want them to have a formal education. But games is wonderful in that YouTube is such a great resource. I don't know any game dev along this board or in the Sage Halls that has not looked up a YouTube tutorial at some point in their career. Because
I still do it. Yeah.
Oh yeah, every day.
I'm self-taught on Unity, so I didn't actually ever take any Unity courses. Everything was kind of like YouTube or like finding out from other people.
Pick it up on the job.
Yeah, picking it up on the job as well. So yeah, like you're saying, if a surgeon was like, I'm self-taught, you'd be worried, but
oh no,
Unity is probably fine.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize too how important that networking point is, because I didn't have it when I got my career, but I can see how it could have gone so much differently, because I had a whole other career before I was in games. I was in film production in Los Angeles for a long time, and then I met an Adelaide girl and I moved here, and I started my games career. I was in visual effects and production management in film, and those skills kind of carried over to being a producer in games, which was my first job. My first 6 years in games was as producer. And those skills really translate over from film to games and really to any creative industry. But when you put that on a resume, you can say, hey, they're asking for this skill, which in particular I don't have, but I have that general skill from this other place, and it makes sense. But them just looking at a piece of paper is like, do I trust that person to be making that leap? Whereas if you talk to them and they're cool and you get a sense of them, it's like, oh, I can see, yeah, this is a pretty solid person who's pretty skilled. They will be able to learn this. And you can't do that in a resume or a cover letter. I mean, I kind of got lucky, but it doesn't work that way for everyone.
It's like a pre-interview, right? It gives you the opportunity to skip that paper stage and go straight to the face-to-face stage. Yeah, totally agree. Given the current nature of the games industry and kind of how full on the last few years have been, I'm sure you've all seen the news, many job losses, studio closures, blah, 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 blah. I find it quite concerning that there's an attitude amongst game students who they feel like when they finish their degree, if they don't get a job in games, they've somehow failed. And I think that sucks as someone who's had work outside of games and brought that knowledge to games. There's a lot of value in taking jobs in adjacent industries. It's arguably a smart idea to maybe, open the doors a bit wider and seek more broadly if you're not quickly finding opportunities in games right now. Because in a couple of years' time, you're going to be bringing incredibly hireable skills back into the games industry when things settle down and get more smooth. But are there any particular sectors, based on what you've seen yourselves, that would benefit greatly from some maturity from outside the industry? Who are you going to throw under the bus?
That's a great question.
And that's the end of our presentation.
I mean, art's a great one because you can always draw in your free time and just continue to build your craft. You can go into like illustration, you can go into design, there's always little ways you can take. It's like a little skill tree that you can just take the branches up as you go, and you can work a retail job and come home and build your craft. It's not just necessarily art, but that's what's in my head because that's what I did. I worked as a florist and I also did art while I was studying for film, not for games. But I kind of made sure everything around me was related in some way to the industry that I wanted to end up being in. And eventually I kind of fell sideways into it. And sometimes you might fall out of it and go and work in another industry, but bringing that back in might be 5-10 years later, you come back into game dev and you'll have this unique worldview and these unique skills and a really kind of growth view on how everything works. And it's great getting and working with these people that have come in and kind of gone in, gone out and have different views rather than to just go, I want to make games, I'm going to go study, I'm going to go straight into games, because working with different people is always great.
Yeah, I do think that games is an incredibly passionate sector. You know, it's filled with people who are just burning with passion for the subject matter, which is amazing. And it's like any of those creative industries, you know, film, etc. as well. But I do think that there's sometimes, some people can zero in really hard on certain things and not sort of zoom out a little bit and say, hey, this has to be done. Like, I know we are making software, but, we're making games, but maybe we could run this like a software project. You know what I mean? Like maybe there's some processes that we can take from outside of what is typically known as how games are made. But I know that there's lots of different ways to make games, and the size of the studio dictates that a lot. But I think sometimes there can be like a little bit of that knowledge share from a completely different angle, as opposed to this person has to do this person has to do this person has to do this. Like, well, could we make it like a product? Could this be more like product design in a way? Could this user experience focus more on the usability of things and that sort of thing as well? So I definitely think there's learnings.
I think, Sarah, you mentioned earlier something about game building, game design, game creation is all about problem solving. It is true of every industry. So any signs of adaptability, of problem solving in other contexts are practical experiences that anyone can showcase if they want to make the plunge and switch to games. But it's also applicable across the board. If you want to move from games to something else, if passion has burnt you for a bit and you just need a calm 9 to 5 to just do something, reset, start again. Do think about how do you solve problems? How do you approach that? Do you think about it in the lens of like risk taking? There's a whole element of risk management in games because you need to protect your assets, you need to protect your brand, you need to think about those things at a certain stage of your project. You need to, solve the technical issues of, my car is driving along the track, but I can't see the wheels moving. What did I do wrong? Is it a problem in my physics? Is it a problem with my rigging? What have I missed there? But there's a lot of those problem-solving skills and adaptability, learning new crafts, learning new software. I'm gonna say, how do you use AI? Like, do you know how to use AI in a way that actually saves you time, and that is respectful of your IP? That you're about sure that your work is not going to start popping up in other people's responses because the model's been trained that way. There's a lot of those skill sets that can be definitely showcased in in a resume, in a portfolio, in job interview, and in just face-to-face conversations with people in general. An advice on resumes. If you want to say something and then you read your resume and you don't see it written, you have not said it. The person reading your resume will not read it either. Don't assume that people know who you are if you don't write it down.
100% true. And also don't forget cover letters. Like, I know I'm an old man, it's an old man thing to say, but your resume just tells me what you've done. Your cover letter is your chance to teach me who you are as a person. So write me cover letters if you're ever applying for jobs with me. All right, we are less than a minute toward the end of our time. That has flown by. Thank you very much, panellists. Really appreciate your expertise. Please join me in thanking our panellists. Please enjoy the rest of the stage.